Marriage for a Greek princess was rarely a matter of personal choice or romance. From the moment she was born, her destiny was carefully calculated by her father, brothers, and court advisors, who viewed her not as a daughter or sister, but as a valuable bargaining chip in the dangerous game of politics. The ancient Greek world was fractured into rival kingdoms and city-states, each seeking advantage over the others through alliances, treaties, and power plays. A young princess, raised in a palace of luxury, quickly learned that her beauty, her chastity, and even her future children were not truly her own. They were assets belonging to her family and her kingdom. When a marriage was arranged, it was not presented as an act of love, but as a contract between two powers. Her hand might be promised to a foreign king to end a war, to a powerful noble to secure loyalty, or even to an enemy ruler as a way of binding him through kinship. The princess herself had no voice in the matter. Her emotions were irrelevant in the face of political necessity. The first night of marriage was, therefore, not only a deeply personal ordeal, but also a public trial. On her shoulders rested the weight of diplomacy, and the outcome of what happened behind closed doors could determine peace or war, loyalty or betrayal. This awareness bred fear long before the wedding night itself. The girl knew she was expected to perform, to please, and to submit in order to guarantee the success of the alliance. She was not entering the bedroom as a bride seeking affection, but as a representative of her father's throne, a vessel of her family's honor. For a young princess, the first night of marriage was less about intimacy and more about the terrifying responsibility of securing the survival of her kingdom. For many Greek princesses, the fear of their first night began with the simple reality of who their husband was. These were not young men close to their own age, but often older rulers, seasoned generals, or widowed kings seeking political security rather than companionship. A girl who had barely reached her teenage years could find herself standing beside a man old enough to be her father, or even her grandfather. The age gap was not just a number, it represented power, dominance, and experience set against youth, innocence, and inexperience. The imbalance was overwhelming. Imagine a 13 or 14-year-old bride entering the marriage chamber, knowing she was expected to please a man 3 times her age, a man who carried not only physical authority, but also the weight of political expectation. She could not meet him as an equal, and she knew it. Every word, every gesture, every response would be judged, not only by her husband, but by the families and kingdoms who had arranged the union. For the older husband, the marriage was simply another step in consolidating his rule. For the young princess, it was the end of her childhood and the beginning of a lifetime of submission. The fear came not only from the physical intimidation of sharing a bed with such a man, but also from the psychological realization that she had no escape. A husband of that age held absolute control, both within the bedroom and within the court. Resistance was unthinkable, and refusal could be interpreted as rebellion against the alliance itself. The first night, therefore, was not just a meeting between bride and groom. It was an encounter between power and vulnerability, where the young princess was painfully aware that her youth was not protection, but weakness. For a Greek princess, marriage was not only the end of her childhood, but also the end of her autonomy. Until the day of her wedding, she lived within the familiar walls of her father's palace, surrounded by her mother, sisters, and affairs, attendants who had raised her. But once she was given away in marriage, everything changed. She left behind her family, her homeland, and the only sense of safety she had ever known. The wedding night symbolized this final break. She was no longer her father's daughter, but her husband's possession, absorbed into a household where she was a stranger. This transition carried with it an immense sense of fear. The princess understood that she would rarely, if ever, see her parents again. Letters were limited, travel was dangerous, and political marriages often meant relocation to distant kingdoms where foreign languages and customs only deepened her isolation. The marriage bed itself became the physical space where this loss of freedom was most sharply felt. For the first time, she was expected to surrender her body to someone else, not out of love or desire, but because the political contract demanded it. There was no option of refusal. The concept of personal choice or individual will held no place in the life of a royal bride. Her obedience was not a matter of personal preference but a political necessity. To resist was to risk dishonor, scandal, or even war. The first night, therefore, carried with it the crushing awareness that her body was no longer her own, her decisions no longer hers to make. What unfolded behind those silk curtains was not simply intimacy, it was the ceremonial transfer of power over her life. For the princess, autonomy ended the moment her wedding night began. For a Greek princess, virginity was more than a matter of personal purity. It was the very foundation of her political worth. From the moment she entered puberty, her body was treated as a guarded treasure, a symbol of her family's honor, and a guarantee of her value in the marriage market. The first night of her marriage was the ultimate test, a moment where this invisible currency was to be proven beyond doubt. The fear came not only from the physical act itself, but from the knowledge that her entire identity, her reputation, and even her kingdom's alliances rested on the presence of a few drops of blood. This cruel expectation reduced her humanity to a biological function. If she bled, she was celebrated as pure, untouched, and therefore worthy of her new role as wife and political partner. If she did not, whether through natural variation, prior injury, or sheer chance, suspicion immediately followed. Whispers of infidelity or secret lovers could destroy not only her life, but also the fragile ties between states that her marriage was meant to secure. Families could demand compensation, treaties could collapse, and the princess herself might face exile, humiliation, or even death. The first night was thus less about intimacy and more about evidence. Servants and officials might wait outside the chamber, ready to inspect the sheets for proof of consummation. The princess entered knowing that her private experience would not remain private. It would be scrutinized, discussed, and recorded as a matter of state. The unbearable pressure transformed what should have been a personal milestone into a public trial. Her virginity was not hers to keep or give. It was a political asset, one that had to be displayed and defended on her very first night as a wife. The wedding night for a Greek princess did not end in the privacy of her chamber. What happened between her and her husband was often expected to be proven in the most public and humiliating way imaginable. Evidence of consummation, usually the bloodied sheets, could be demanded by officials, attendants, or even members of the royal court. What should have been an intimate moment of vulnerability was instead transformed into a spectacle, a ritual designed to reassure families, allies, and entire kingdoms that the union was real and binding. This practice placed unbearable weight on the young bride. She knew that her body was not only serving her husband but also testifying before an audience. And she could not see. Outside her chamber, whispers waited. Servants stood ready to carry the sheets, courtiers prepared to discuss them, and sometimes even foreign envoys demanded to know the outcome. Her first night became a performance, with physical proof serving as the final seal of a political contract. The humiliation of this expectation cannot be overstated. A teenage girl, frightened and inexperienced, was forced to understand that her most private experience would be reduced to evidence for others to inspect. If the proof was lacking, disaster could follow. Accusations of impurity might shatter her reputation. Doubts about consummation could threaten the alliance her marriage was meant to secure. And in extreme cases, the princess herself could be cast aside, disgraced, or even quietly eliminated to avoid scandal. Instead of comfort or safety, the morning after her wedding night brought dread. She had no control over how her body would respond, no way to guarantee the proof others demanded. Her first steps into married life were marked by surveillance and judgment, leaving her trapped in a system where intimacy itself was turned into evidence. Religion hovered over every aspect of a Greek princess's life, and the wedding night was no exception. The union of bride and groom was not viewed merely as a personal or political matter, but as a sacred act overseen by the gods. Rituals, prayers, and offerings often preceded the consummation, reminding the young bride that her body was not only bound to her husband, but also dedicated to divine authority. Instead of finding solace in faith, many princesses feared the weight of these expectations, knowing that failing to fulfill her role was seen as offending both family and gods. Priests and priestesses were sometimes involved in the ceremonies leading up to the marriage bed, blessing the couple, invoking protection, and demanding fertility from the divine. For the princess, thus, is created a suffocating sense of duty. Her first night was not about her emotions or readiness, it was about becoming a vessel for children who would carry dynasties forward, fulfilling what was considered a divine purpose. The gods were believed to watch, and failure to conceive after marriage could lead to suspicions of divine displeasure. This religious framing only deepened the sense of fear. The princess knew she was walking into a ritualized transition from maiden to wife, one with cosmic significance in the eyes of her people. If she resisted, hesitated, or failed to produce heirs quickly, blame could fall squarely on her shoulders. Families, advisors, and subjects might whisper that she was cursed, impious, or unworthy. Instead of receiving comfort from her faith, the princess often found herself burdened by it. The sacred atmosphere of her wedding night transformed what might have been a private beginning into a spiritual test. Every action, every outcome, carried with it the shadow of divine judgment. The youth of many Greek princesses was the greatest source of their fear on the wedding night. These girls were often married off while still in their early teens, sometimes scarcely past the threshold of childhood. Their husbands, by contrast, were frequently men of considerable age and experience, rulers, generals, or heirs who had lived long enough to understand politics and power. The bride, in comparison, entered the marriage bed knowing almost nothing about her own body, let alone about the expectations that would soon be placed upon it. This extreme gap in age and knowledge left the princess profoundly vulnerable. Her inexperience meant she could not advocate for herself or resist the weight of duty pressing down on her. A young girl's natural fear and confusion were not only ignored but deliberately silenced. In fact, her innocence was often considered desirable, as it symbolized purity and made her more malleable in the hands of her husband and his court. What was seen as an asset by others was, for her, a source of dread. The physical risks were equally frightening. A body that had not yet fully matured faced real dangers during consummation, pain, trauma, and in some cases lasting harm. None of this mattered to those arranging the marriage. What mattered was securing an alliance, ensuring heirs, and strengthening dynasties. For the princess herself, however, the wedding night could feel less like a celebration and more like a violent end to her childhood. The fear of that night was compounded by her awareness that life would never again be the same. Her carefree existence as a daughter and child was stripped away in a single moment, replaced by adult obligations she neither chose nor understood. Vulnerability defined her entry into married life. Stepping into her husband's palace often meant stepping into a world of total isolation for a Greek princess. Marriage almost always required her to leave behind her homeland, her family, and everything familiar. Surrounded by strangers who spoke different dialects, followed different customs, and owed loyalty only to her husband, she became a foreigner in the very household she was expected to rule. On her wedding night, the weight of this loneliness pressed down hardest, as she realized that the walls around her no longer belonged to her, but to others who might view her with suspicion. This sense of displacement was more than emotional, it was political. Every move she made was watched, every word measured against the expectations of her new court. Servants whispered about her manners, advisors questioned her loyalty, and even the common people might judge her as an outsider. The intimacy of her first night with her husband became bound up in this atmosphere of scrutiny. She was expected to embrace her role without hesitation, but in truth she faced it in solitude, cut off from the support systems that once gave her confidence. The fear of betrayal only deepened her isolation. In-laws could see her as a rival influence, courtiers might resent her foreign origins, and even her husband's affections were uncertain. Should she stumble in fulfilling her duties, there would be no parents, siblings, or childhood friends to shield her. She entered marriage knowing that she had been sent not to be loved, but to serve as a living bond between two powers. On that first night, the loneliness was palpable. Far from home, far from anyone she could trust, she lay beside a man who was both partner and stranger, knowing that her future depended entirely on her ability to survive in a court that was not her own. No expectation weighed more heavily on a Greek princess than the demand to produce heirs. Her marriage was never simply about companionship. It was about securing the lineage of her husband's dynasty and ensuring political stability for generations to come. From the very first night, she knew that her value as a wife would be judged by her ability to conceive quickly and bear sons. The bedchamber was transformed into a political arena where her fertility became a matter of state concern. This immense pressure left little room for personal choice or natural timing. If months passed without signs of pregnancy, blame rarely fell on the husband. Suspicion instead turned toward the bride. Whispers of infertility, curses from the gods, or even secret misconduct could tarnish her reputation. In some cases, women who failed to provide heirs faced rejection, replacement, or humiliation at court. A princess who could not deliver sons risked being cast aside, no matter how noble her birth. The wedding night marked the beginning of this lifelong burden. What should have been an intimate moment became the starting line of a race to prove her worth. Every glance from courtiers, every comment from attendants carried the unspoken question of whether she would succeed. The fear was not only of failing her husband, but of failing her family, her kingdom, and the alliance sealed by her marriage. For the young bride, this pressure stripped the wedding night of tenderness. Instead of experiencing closeness, she lay awake calculating her future, knowing that her survival depended on producing a child, and not just any child, but a male heir. In that single expectation, her identity as a daughter and woman dissolved into her role as a vessel for dynastic continuity. Consent was a concept that scarcely existed for Greek princesses on their wedding nights. Their marriages were arranged by fathers, brothers, or political councils, leaving the young women with no voice in the most personal decision of their lives. By the time the ceremony was complete, the princess had already been handed over as part of a bargain between men. The wedding night was simply the physical culmination of this transaction, where her body became the final piece of property transferred from one household to another. This absence of choice turned the night into an ordeal of fear and submission. The princess might not even know her husband well, having exchanged only a handful of words with him before being placed in his bed. There was no opportunity to express hesitation, no space to ask for time, and no right to refuse. Her silence was expected, and her compliance assumed. To resist was unthinkable, not only because of the power imbalance, but because defiance could be seen as rebellion against her family's honour and the alliance they had secured. The physical act itself underscored this lack of agency. While the husband exercised dominance, the bride was expected to endure. Even if she was frightened, in pain, or emotionally unprepared, her feelings carried no weight. The act of consummation was framed as a duty, a confirmation of the marriage's legitimacy, rather than a shared experience. For the princess, the lack of consent stripped the night of intimacy and turned it into a ritual of role. She was not a partner, but a participant without choice, forced into a role defined by others. The realization that her wishes did not matter, and perhaps never would, cast a long shadow over her first night as a wife. Whispers within palace walls often carried warnings, and one of the most frightening realities for Greek princesses was the threat of cruelty on their wedding nights. A young bride could never be certain of her husband's temperament once the doors were closed. Some men were patient, treating consummation as a ceremonial duty, but others were harsh, careless, or even violent. For a girl barely past childhood, the possibility of facing aggression from a man she hardly knew made the night feel less like a celebration and more like a trial by ordeal. Unlike common women, a princess's suffering could not be openly spoken of, as her pain was buried beneath the weight of dynastic expectations. If her new husband chose to assert his dominance with force, she had no recourse. Complaints were unthinkable, as they could embarrass her family or jeopardize the fragile political bond her marriage represented. In this silence, cruelty was allowed to fester, and fear became an unspoken companion. Even if outright violence did not occur, the psychological threat loomed large. The princess knew her husband had absolute authority in the marriage bed. His dissatisfaction, whether imagined or real, could erupt into punishment. This uncertainty was its own form of torment, a gnawing dread that transformed every moment of her first night into a test of survival. For many, the possibility of cruelty left scars deeper than physical pain. The memory of being powerless before a man's will marked the beginning of their married lives, instilling a lasting fear of intimacy. What should have been the foundation of companionship instead became a reminder that their bodies were not their own, and that even within the opulent chambers of royalty, violence could be hidden beneath silken sheets. The walls of a royal chamber were never truly silent, and for a Greek princess, her first night was haunted not only by her husband, but also by the invisible presence of countless eyes and ears. Servants, attendants, and family members might not be inside the room, yet their influence pressed down on the couple like a suffocating weight. Everyone waited for proof that the marriage had been properly sealed, and this knowledge turned intimacy into performance. The princess knew that her sheets would not remain private. In many courts they would be inspected the next morning by older women of the household, sometimes even displayed to male relatives as undeniable evidence of consummation. This practice robbed the moment of any sense of secrecy, replacing personal experience with political validation. The girl entered her chamber with the chilling awareness that every movement of the night would eventually be reduced to stains on fabric, passed along like courtroom evidence. Servants intensified the tension. Some were loyal to the bride, others to the groom, and many to powerful factions within the court. Their whispered reports could elevate or destroy reputations. A servant's word that the princess hesitated too long, cried too loudly, or appeared unwilling might reach her in-laws by dawn. Family members too placed enormous pressure, reminding her beforehand of the honour she carried and the disgrace she would bring if she failed. This web of surveillance meant the princess was never truly alone. Even in the most intimate moments, she was acting before an audience she could not see. The weight of scrutiny stripped her wedding night of any sense of personal choice, transforming it into a carefully monitored ritual where failure carried consequences far beyond her own life. One of the most suffocating fears for a Greek princess on her wedding night came from the dangerous blend of medical ignorance and superstition that surrounded female bodies. Ancient and medieval physicians, though revered as experts, often held ideas that today would be considered shocking in their inaccuracy. A bride's body was treated less as her own and more as a mystery to be unlocked by her husband, guided by flawed beliefs that turned the night into a frightening experiment. It was widely thought that a woman's ability to conceive depended on her physical openness, which consummation was supposed to guarantee. Some even believed that a woman needed to experience pleasure for pregnancy to occur, placing unbearable pressure on a terrified girl to perform desire convincingly. Others imagined that excessive passion marked her as immoral, while too little response suggested barrenness. In either case, she could be judged harshly, her reputation and future riding on the interpretations of men who had no real understanding of her body. Medical practices themselves could be brutal. Remedies were often prescribed to prepare a girl for marriage, from restrictive diets to strange tonics believed to increase fertility or reduce fear. These concoctions, far from helping, frequently caused illness or weakness, making the ordeal of the wedding night even more daunting. What terrified many princesses most was the lack of control. If her husband or the court physicians deemed her body defective, whether she failed to bleed, failed to conceive, or failed to behave as expected, she alone carried the blame. Miscarriages, infertility, or even the natural variation of women's anatomy were interpreted as personal failings or signs of impurity. In a world blinded by medical misconceptions, a princess entered her first night knowing that her very survival depended not on truth, but on superstition. Once the celebrations faded and the ceremonial duties of the wedding night were declared complete, a Greek princess often found herself sinking into a life of suffocating isolation. Marriage, far from granting her companionship or security, usually meant being uprooted from the familiar embrace of her family and placed in the household of her husband, where she was both honoured and trapped. The transition was abrupt, one day surrounded by siblings, attendants, and her mother's guidance, the next confined within foreign walls where every face was new and most were watching her with suspicion. The loneliness was not simply emotional, it was political. Her presence in her husband's home was a strategic alliance, and she was expected to keep her loyalties firmly tied to him, not to her natal family. Letters to parents or siblings were often restricted, monitored, or discouraged entirely, leaving her cut off from the only people who might understand her fears. Even when surrounded by servants, she remained alone, for these attendants were more loyal to the household than to her, their tongues quick to report any misstep. The silence of her new surroundings deepened her dread. Without the comfort of familiar companionship, every glance from her husband carried more weight. Every criticism stung more sharply. She had no confidant to share her anxieties, no trusted friend to ease her heart. This solitude magnified the terror of intimacy, making the wedding night not just a single ordeal, but the beginning of an unending exile into emotional isolation. For many princesses, this loneliness was perhaps the cruelest consequence of their role. Draped in jewels and silks, they appeared powerful to the outside world, but behind closed doors, they were young girls cut adrift, isolated figures forced to carry the burdens of dynastic politics entirely on their own shoulders. The most haunting fear that shadowed a Greek princess on her wedding night was the realization that she was stepping into a role from which there was no return. From that moment onward, her body, her choices, and even her emotions ceased to belong to her. The marriage was not about love or companionship. It was about the dynasty, the alliance, and the survival of kingdoms. Her first night symbolized the beginning of a life where autonomy was stripped away and duty became her defining identity. A princess could not decide if she wanted children. It was demanded of her. She could not choose when or if she desired intimacy. That decision belonged to her husband and to the expectations of the court. Even the smallest aspects of her existence, what she wore, how she behaved in public, how she smiled or remained silent, were monitored and judged as reflections of political honor. The wedding night, therefore, was less a personal experience and more a ceremonial surrender of individuality. This lifelong burden extended beyond the walls of her chamber. Every child she bore was a political instrument, every miscarriage a scandal, every hesitation a potential betrayal. Failure in any of these roles was not just personal, it was dynastic, with consequences that could ripple through armies and treaties. Knowing this, the princess entered her marriage already carrying the crushing weight of a nation's expectations. What made the burden most unbearable was its permanence. A princess could never walk away. Divorce, independence, or refusal were not options. From the night she lay beneath the gaze of silken sheets, she understood that her life had been traded away as part of a bargain she had no voice in. The loss of autonomy was not temporary, it was the defining tragedy of her existence.